Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons, a philosophy podcast about big topics in bite-sized pieces. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education at Liberty University. And with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of philosophy and English at Genesee Community College. Love is in the air. Well, at least in the airwaves. Today we'll be talking about all of the concepts that constitute our idea of love. From our favorite colors to our lifelong partners, where do we draw the line on what we consider love? Are there ethical issues we need to account for when discussing love? How does love affect us differently from a physical, emotional, or psychological viewpoint? Is there a universality across humankind in regards to love, or is the experience highly individual? Stick with us as we delve into these topics and try to uncover the mysteries of love. All right, so here we are, a couple weeks after Valentine's Day, talking about love. I'll admit that when we started to research it a little bit, I was not super enthused. I'd rather talk about the origin of the universe or something else. Love really doesn't tickle my fancy. But then the more I got into it, the more I started to realize, man, this, maybe even more than anything else we've talked about, kind of does touch on each of the philosophical mainstays.
It does. It weaves them together.
There's a lot of aesthetics. There's a lot of free will and self and knowledge, and all of those things play into, the idea of love. So I'm pretty excited about it now and see how it works out. So let's start with trying to define or, come up with a description for love. Generally, I think that it falls into two categories. There's an impersonal and there's an interpersonal. Would you agree with that? Is that kind of how philosophy?
Broadly, although I would say that the most traditional ancient philosophers, up through A.C. Grayling, who's still writing, he has a marvelous essay on this. He has, I think it's 8 definitions of categories. So yeah, the interpersonal and the within is a good start.
Okay. So how have philosophers defined love in the past? Give us, what was the original definition? Where did they think that it stemmed from? What did they think the cause was? What's the background?
Back to the pre-Socratics. So, and the Socratics, that cluster. So you have essentially 3 kinds under which they've construed things. So philia, which is friendship, love of brothers, the camaraderie kind of thing. And eros, which is the passionate erotic love, and then agape, which is selfless love of humanity and construed as coming from far beyond ourselves. That's where the Christian and other spiritual traditions really go a lot.
Okay. That's cool. That's a good start. And that makes me think about, trying to define love is really a super fuzzy border that I don't think people consider too much, because we sort of throw the word around in our modern culture. So you mentioned, Philadelphia, brotherly love. So, but I think that there's a lot of philosophers that would draw a distinction between loving something and liking something, or loving something and having a friendship. So how do you draw those lines? Do you and I have a friendship, or do we have brotherly love? Where does that distinction?
Well, the ancients, all right. So Aristotle said that philia is the highest form of love. So from Aristotle's viewpoint, you and I would be having a very dynamic philia, philia, which is to say, learning from each other and growing therefrom for the conversations and probing the universe, all for the purposes of enjoying the company and becoming better in the world. So it leads to an ethical component. But yeah, it was, Aristotle says it's the highest form of intimacy. Trumps everything else. I don't want to say that word. But anyway, it overcomes other things. On the hierarchy, it's the highest for Aristotle. But his teacher, Plato, said, so he denied his teacher, which was fine. Plato says that eros of all things, passion, because for Plato, erotic love, the passions mean that you are finding beauty in very specific things, whether elements of objects or people, and that concentration on detail within another person or a piece of art. I've just been admiring one of your instruments, and it's it's not what you would call erotic love in the case of the 21st century and all the websites people go to, that kind of stuff. But it is the sense of finding beauty in very particular shapes or details. And that Plato says, of course, that it's self-fulfilling for him. It leads back to the ideals of form. So he says that kind of love can take you to realize that the universe is composed of forms, and we can recognize the beauty in that.
That's kind of an interesting insight. So it's highly aesthetic in nature. Is it the aesthetics of it, the shapes, that make it important to him, or is it what the motivation that it leads to? Because I think if you look at it, probably eros leads to the highest amount of human motivation. If you have brotherly love with somebody, you'll probably have a lot of engaging discussions and you'll have a very close friendship. But in terms of how that spurs you to action, or, with an agape love spurring you to action. But with eros, you can think of plenty of situations where, essentially somebody's passion draws them into action. Is that part of the component, or is it?
So basically you just walked us through about 2,000 years ago. So, as you are wont to do. All right. So for Plato, it's qualities, and recognizing qualities as universally recognizable qualities, and therefore the structure of the universe itself in some important way. What you just said about philia is interesting, because leaping forward to the later 20th century and into now, there is this huge discussion going on of the moral motivation of love. So essentially, whether it's filial joy or love in a erotic or passionate sense, it's still constraining and shaping our moral response to the larger universe. And so it's a process. So we don't generally break down the categories in the same kind of ways that the ancients did, but looking at the process of what any combination of love, kinds of love, do to the way we move in the world and how we try to attain some moral good.
Okay. So I think that we still need to come back to defining it a little bit. So I go out, I definitely have friends where we go and we do some rock climbing, or we hang out and, do something like that. But maybe we don't have discussions like this. So that would be a friendship. And so I'm just trying to figure out where are we drawing the lines here between, if we're trying to form this, a cell wall of love, but it's a highly osmotic barrier. There's things that are coming in and out. Like, how do we actually even define what it is?
Well, if you think about the idea of a meeting and bonding of equals, primarily to find wisdom or to accomplish something joyful or something self-revelatory, something that grows oneself, that's the filial love. You're just, the things you've told me of the military, for instance, never leave someone behind, and you always have to have each other's backs. So that is the essence of one kind of filial love. I know there'd be people grumbling, I know, so don't use that word, but you do. You love each other. You are comrades. And while you may not talk philosophically, although some may have a smoke and talk about life and death, but you are bonded and you are seeking something together. If that is only to stay alive and to accomplish a mission, the word only doesn't fit with that. That's pretty major. So that would be, in the ancient definition, filial love.
Okay. So we have that, and that makes sense. Do you think that can be extrapolated to agape love and eros love and personal and interpersonal?
Yes.
Okay. So it sounds like then that in order for there to be love as opposed to friendship with a person or admiration of a piece of art, it sounds like there has to be an emotional and intellectual quality mixed into the initial attraction or interaction with the medias. Okay. All right. So I think that's a good segue into, the purposes of love and really looking at the physical and emotional and psychological reasons for it. Now, we're not an explicit podcast, so there's things we're going to stay away from. All right. But with those boundaries set, what are those categories, those things that we established? There has to be an emotional and intellectual piece to love. What are some of the things that are the physical or intellectual, and how do they interact?
It's not unacceptably explicit. Let's go to Schopenhauer, for instance. Schopenhauer is the pessimist, in the 19th century. So Schopenhauer basically was anticipating, I think, neurocognitive philosophy, which we've talked about before, and in some ways evolutionary issues before they were full-blown discussed, because he was always dour. He was the Eeyore of philosophers. And Schopenhauer said, let's basically, I'm paraphrasing awfully, let's face it. It's just about procreation, where it's just about keeping the species going. And we decorate it with all this other stuff so that we can accept that. But if we get right down to the basis of it, it is about the urge to survive, the urge to wrestle with the other thing we've talked about, which is death.
Right. So all of the dating and, picking out drapes and all of this stuff is essentially just peacock feathers.
That's what he would say. Yeah. But the Romanticist movement, capital R, in the 17, 18, and even 1900s, even now in art sometimes, but the largest was then. This was the unrequited love. This was recognizing the power of nature as a metaphor for the power of one's own feelings. And if those feelings didn't get requited, then you're making powerful art, because you're recognizing the Sturm und Drang. You're recognizing that waves crashing and lightning and mountains, which just diminish all of us into this tiny dot, are all the power of nature and the power of emotions. And this overwhelms us almost to the point of horror, which is a kind of sublimity. And so we recognize the sublime by being denied.
That's a super interesting thing you just mentioned, because this might be a little bit off topic, but I don't think it is. I was reading an article yesterday and I thought about sending it to you, but I didn't. It was a scientist was, they're trying to figure out how to get kids interested in science and stuff. And basically what he found through this study that he did was that in order to get kids interested in science, you need to inspire awe. So you need to make them have a moment where they're aware of things that are outside of their knowledge schemas and, beyond their ability to comprehend. And then once you have that moment, that by itself will cause an interest in them, because now they feel like, okay, well, now I have to understand what that is and I have to build knowledge schemas. It's almost like an instinctive imperative. You have to do it. So that was kind of an interesting study. And that's almost a form of love because we're talking about the emotional and the intellectual component, like that feeling of awe. That's exactly what a feeling of awe is.
Awe is passion of a kind. And that's what the romantic movement was about. It wasn't to say that love, just physical. No, this is why the awesomeness of the elements and recognizing our place in it. That's why the Hudson School of Art, the Hudson Valley School of Art, where you see very small figures standing on a ledge and the entire Catskill Range in front with maybe a thunderstorm over there, and the awe of it. Just like cosmologists, people study the beginnings of the universe. So, Carl Sagan talking about the pale blue dot, which some of my students still enjoy, that to realize how small we are, and yet the passion for life that is ignited by that is a requisite part of love of what one does.
So is that a agape love? Would that fall into that definition, or
it can if it makes you appreciate humanity itself, or put the word itself with it, whatever, life itself, the big picture. So, and then, agape goes into Christian and other spiritual traditions, which is looking at the big picture for the sake of caring for others beyond oneself, which is altruistic version of agape. So, yes, it's osmotic, as you said before.
Okay. All right. So we've covered some of, I think that covers a lot of the emotional and psychological sort of impact. What about cultural considerations? Do you think that a setting, and somebody's background influences love? And I feel like on face value, that question seems kind of ridiculous because anybody who follows any sort of, is into 21st century psychology or sociology realizes that people and cultures are highly individual systems. Like there's no one size fits all. But at the same time, you can look out and see love in pretty much every culture. So it begs the question, well, maybe it's something that it is a universally encountered.
It is. Yeah. And this is where you mentioned before, drawing in all of the different elements of branches of philosophy. This is where people like Martha Nussbaum, who was very major, still is, she's still with us, talking about the epistemology of love. And so if it's not just these wandering freelance moments, if there is such a thing as love that lasts, and if we can see it, if we go to a different place and we see people who we say are obviously in love, the epistemologist would say, well, how do you know? Right? And people like Martha Nussbaum and Annette Bayer would say that it's about the integrated structure of relationship. So it's not just, I kiss you and therefore we must be in love. Man says to woman or woman says to woman or whatever. No, it's not the flash in the pan thing. It's, do I want to watch you grow older and embrace the changes, because there will be changes. And so is it all integrated? There are patterns, there are habits, and all of those things are part of the recognizable knowledge of love, even if we haven't quantified it entirely.
Okay, but so you mentioned how love is more than, you want to grow old with somebody and that sort of things, but now we're coming back to the categories that we established earlier. So there's eros, and that's the passion and whatnot. And I guess that this is just an alternate form of the philia question we were talking about earlier. When we were trying to establish what's a friendship and what is brotherly love, now we're trying to do the same thing, but with romantic relationships. So there's plenty of people that might say, based on the duration of a fling that they have, they might consider it love or not, even if they don't have an intent to grow old with these people, or maybe it's not that malicious. It's not that they don't have an intent to, it's just something that doesn't occur to them. So where do we draw the line with that then? How would we establish eros love? I mean, it almost sounds like that would be the definition of it, but I think that we might be getting caught up in old terms as well that have transferred.
Good for you. Robert Solomon would, I think, say good for you. He was a neo-existentialist. I like that term. Anyway, we're getting too caught up, or some would say, not you and I personally, but in this discussion is reflecting of this, we can get so caught up in categorization that we miss the more dynamic quantum fluidity of it. So that, for instance, Robert Solomon says we have to view it as a dynamic thing. We have to look at how we live in this specific historical moment, in this specific cultural context, governs our intimacy with others. And whatever that intimacy is, if that intimacy is an important shaping of our own identity, then it's love. And so the neo-existentialists would say, what's with all of these subcategorizations when one really ought to be recognizing the word intimacy and all the categorizations that can imply, because every intimate relation is not the same thing. You can have a marvelous friendship never having met somebody and write with any unrestraint about the thoughts that one has, the feelings that one has about this life, which is not an attempt to engage in an erotic relationship, but which creates an intimacy, an undeniable intimacy of thought, which then shapes one's own identity as one continues to think upon feelings and thoughts. And so instead of getting hung up in what kind of love is this? What kind of love is this? Is this intimate in any way or is it not?
So that comes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is there an intellectual and emotional component that shapes self-identity to an extent? So there we go. We have self, we have the idea of language and how language all plays into this. So all the philosophical themes are coming together in this discussion, which is why it's it's a cool topic to talk about.
It is. And there's still Alain de Botton, who is also still alive, says we have a very tenuous grip on what love means. See, this is why you would like his work, and so we try to be mature in our relationships. We analyze what we think love is. He says, so this is right on point, and we look at our emotions and what our motivations are, and this is where the ethics come. It would be hard to say that you love someone if you're just using them as a means to an end. And then we go back to Kant and categorical imperative, which is you must never think you're ethical if you're using somebody just for your own purposes to your own end. And so he picks that up and says, we don't really know a whole lot about what love is. We experience it, varieties of it, but if in fact it is leading us to our own maturity, and that's the identity thing, then it must be good.
Okay. So that helps us, conceptualize a little bit more. So now we're going to throw a whole new monkey wrench into the works, which is getting back to talking about different cultural, religious, and environmental differences, because what that adds into it now is that if we, we're starting to understand that, if you have an emotional and an intellectual connection that's shaping you, then that it's a love of some kind. But now what we're finding is that across different cultures and religions and environments, what constitutes the emotional and the intellectual and the aesthetic interactions is going to change. What is aesthetically appealing to us is going to be completely different to somebody in West Senegal, or it's a different place in the world. And religiously, the same thing. Certain, one religion is going to hold something to be more emotionally interactive than another one. Intellectually, obviously, you can see that even within cultures, what people interact with, what they think about is going to change from person to person. So now we have a whole different sort of...
A hymn just came to mind that I sang in my youth when I was in church choir, and I even sang when I was attending a local church for a while. And the part of the refrain is, "And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own." And in some versions of that, he tells me I'm his friend. But he walks with me, and he talks with me. Well, that sounds pretty filial. But it sounds like a filial agape, because it is, if Jesus can walk with everyone and talk with everyone at the same time in their own unique ways, there's this very interesting meshing of those two things. I can't speak Quranically on that because I don't... as I understand it, and as I've understood it from Muslim friends and students, and reading the Quran, it's not the same kind of personal relationship necessarily, but it's more of a direct thinking of Allah.
And I wonder how much of that comes down to...
But I don't know that for absolutely certain.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that comes down to deity diversification. Like if you look at...
That's an interesting term.
I just coined it now. So if you look at Christianity, they have the idea of a triune God. So you have God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and they're perceived to have different relational interactions with the human. And I think that maybe the agape versus the filial versus, in the case of the Holy Spirit, maybe even more of an eros sort of thing, living within you. Maybe that plays a part. And probably with Hinduism and a whole bunch of different gods, you have a similar dynamic. Whereas with, Islam or maybe Buddhism, which is more of a philosophy than a religion, those elements are sort of absent.
I don't know about absent. I wouldn't say absent for Islam. I think there's very, very deep, passionate love of God, love of Allah. That absolutely is there, and there's a logic to the stories, the sacred stories. So I think it might not be exactly the same balance if we're trying to do the weights and measures empiricism, but I think what you hit upon is actually those three elements probably run through all of the spiritual traditions, and that's the important part, because now epistemologically we can say, okay, there's a universality to the three things that Aristotle was talking about.
Yeah, and probably that perception from the different religious members is a huge formational part of the belief system. Because if you suggested to a Christian that they believe in a polytheistic system, they would be very upset, because it's a triune God. It's three gods in one, but it's not three gods. Whereas in Hinduism, they do see it as three gods. Whereas in Islam, it's just one God, but he has these three different qualities. And all of these things probably really...
But don't tell that to the Unitarians.
Yeah.
Well, the oneness of everything, who also have this marvelous hymn to evolution that I just love. This is back to the hymn again. My first time ever experiencing the marvel of I'm not underwriting or endorsing anything. I just to be a student and to with my then girlfriend to go to and now wife to go to a church where there was extolling the joyful beauty of the primordial slime out of which we emerged in a church setting was mind-blowing. But even for a young person that I was at that point, that pulled together this idea of love of scientific knowledge that can lead us to spiritual revelation. All in one package.
Yeah, it's funny.
With the aesthetic, the music.
Yeah.
See,
It's funny because having a philosophical conversation like this and, starting with identifying major elements and then moving into how it works with culture, I just have this idea in our head of like being like anthropologists, being dressed up as Indiana Jones in a jungle somewhere and discovering these different, oh, wow, how do they do this, and that's really what we're doing, but on an intellectual level is we're looking at different religions and cultures. And we have those main tenets that we established. Now we're trying to figure out how these vastly different cultures or religions or places incorporate those elements into their society.
If I'm going off track, you can tell me, but you just inspired a number of things. One, in the show that I'm directing now, it's March 2019, called Encounters. And I was telling you before we started, one of my students from Kersal has written a poem, and in the poem, one of the poems is called Reality Is, and he's taking on a lot of things, and that's the refrain, reality is. And he says at one point in his poem, reality is, love is lust now. And he separates a couple, both of whom are very upset with each other because that's it. And it points to a not misinterpretation, but an overabundance of focus on the immediate physical to the detraction of relationship across the culture. I mean, that's part of what's happening with what's led so much with Me Too, with women who can't turn right, left, or center, but somebody's either trying to touch them or have them or assume a physical ownership, or the boundary issues abound. And the ancients would say that's because there's a gross imbalance in what we understand love to be.
Yeah, and that's interesting because what we're seeing is a huge societal shift in what's acceptable in terms of relationships in love within the past 5 years tops. That's short time frame. We're seeing this huge change, but I don't think that it's so much that things were vastly different before. But I think it's the social media aspect. So it's doing good and bad with that imbalance of lust. So essentially, you have So on the one hand, it makes it much more easily acceptable and accessible to act on and instantly gratify lust with certain apps and things. But on the other hand, it gives people a platform to express dissatisfaction with a lust imbalance that has existed for decades, centuries, since the beginning of humanity. So now, for the first time, some of these underprivileged groups have a platform to express dissatisfaction with a way they've been treated in such a way.
I'm not in isolation anymore. There's this voice, and there are these 100 voices, and there's these 1,000 voices. Okay, yeah.
So it's a super interesting dynamic because you see the imbalance, and then you see how this explosion of social media has done good and not necessarily bad, but you're just seeing the variety of influences it's having with the concept of love, and how it's, I think that it was a latent, inherent part of culture for a very long period of time, but now it's something that's very much in the spotlight.
And that's why we go back to Platon, who said that we have a limited grasp on this, and we have to keep thinking about it every day and keep feeling about it every day until we've reached some kind of maturity with this.
Because, that's my slogan in life, is that everything is education and philosophy, because every second you're learning something, and then the next second you're making sense of what you just learned. And so that's my biggest pet peeve with people. You can believe whatever you want, and I'm not going to have an issue with that. I might question how you got to that point, and I might make you walk through the steps, show your work, but you're entitled to believe what you want to believe. That's not any of my business. But what my business is if you you have this viewpoint and you're unwilling to accept any change when introduced to outside information. That's the...
And if you act on that viewpoint in such a way that you are causing harm to others.
So that might seem off topic, but I think that has a lot to do with relationships too, because bringing in our idea of self and our ship of Theseus and whatnot, 10 years from now, my wife, you, anybody that you know is not going to be the same person. Whether or not they are the same person with different planks, different boards on their ship, or whether or not they are a different person, the point is they will not be identical to how they are now. And so if you're unwilling to accept outside information, you're unwilling to accept change, that's going to wreak havoc with your relationships and your idea of love. So really, this is just a soapbox moment. My personal view is that you have to be willing to at least look at and determine the validity of outside information at any point it's presented to you. We can't afford to just be presented with something and on face value, throw it out the window.
Nope. That's a good soapbox. This is Kevin Perry. Kevin Perry was summarizing the moral motivation love discussion that's gone on since the 1990s, and it's still very much part of the philosophical discussion. Love constrains the motivations we have. It shapes us and provides us with the values or ends that guide our reasons to doing things. Love helps stabilize our various impulses, desires, and concerns, and helps direct our actions toward a focused goal that is larger than ourselves. Now that's ancient in the sense of whether it's filial love or finding beauty to be a universal guide to goodness. Whatever it is, the idea of stability. I love the stabilizes. That seems essential to consistency in morals, ethics, whatever one wants to call it. And that it guides you to something larger. It doesn't say it has to guide you to something spiritual, but it guides you to something. And my soapbox moment, absolutely. These conversations that we have guide me to rethinking things that I'm talking to my students about and connect me with past conversations. My relationship with my wife, where we converse about getting older, and it's not always a smooth discussion because one perceives oneself very differently at a point in life. At 61, I don't perceive myself as 61. I'm told that that's getting old. Okay, well, yeah, I get that. But it doesn't faze me. Perhaps it should, but it doesn't. Not out of some resistance to, I can't be that. Well, of course I'm going to be that. And becoming that. But it doesn't feel that way. Tomorrow, perhaps it does. Tomorrow, perhaps I'm gone. And it's that nowness that I think is really essential. Tomorrow is really not up to worrying about because right now is so a conversation can lead to art. A lovely discussion with your wife can lead to writing a song. An emotional moment with a cast of young actors accomplishing something on stage that makes you realize I wouldn't have been anywhere else at any moment else than choosing to be right here with them, realizing that moment. That's what I think that this means of helping direct our actions toward a focused goal that is larger than who we are.
Right. And and we're absolutely doing that. I think that some people might listen to it and think, okay, well, they've done a lot of research and have this planned out. But I mean, if I'm asking you a question on here, there's probably about a 50% chance whether I'm asking you rhetorically so that the listener can understand, or whether I'm genuinely asking you. No, really, tell me, because I'm learning, you're learning as we're doing this, because there's new information being presented from different perspectives and we're making sense out of it as we're doing it. And that's what philosophy is. It's not studying old books. It's establishing new knowledge now.
Philosophia, the love of knowledge.
Yeah. So that's good. And I think that it, at the very beginning of what you were just saying, it brings us into love and morality and ethics. So can love ever be evil?
Being rhetorical. Or asking, are we rhetorically probing that question, Joel?
If I told you, then people would never know just how dumb I actually am.
No, quite the opposite.
So I guess there's two questions there.
Yeah.
Can love be evil? Which is, I think, the more difficult question. And then,
okay. So you can tell me to shush, but I'm going to come into this for a second. I'm going to take an example that just comes to mind because of past volunteer work and everyday life with the people we live among in my students. This is age independent, domestic violence situation, where it's predominantly men abusing women, but it also happens in other alternate gender relationships. And if a person is harming another person and claiming that they love them, no viable ethical system in this world would say yes. Any traditional religious system that says you can harm your wife, that's where I'm just off the ranch entirely. No, if you can harm another person because you love them, then you really don't love them. Now, let's take something else because I can just hear voices saying, well, what if you're a parent and you have to be stern with your child? Being stern with a child is a very vague term. If you're stern with a child trying to guide them and you love them, and if they don't understand what you're trying to do for them and they might feel hurt by it emotionally, and it's healthy, that will go away. But if you're causing harm to a child, you don't love them. And if you convince yourself that you do, then you need help.
Yeah, I think that there's the three aspects to that again. You know, we talked about the physical and the emotional and the psychological. And the quote that you just read talks about how, you know, love is about forming those end goals, getting to those focused points. And so bringing those three together, what you realize is that if the intent of discipline is to bring a child to maturity, help them grow up, help them see an error of their way, and you're not doing harm in a physical, emotional, or intellectual fashion, then it's discipline. But if you're going to cause harm in one of those ways, or if you're causing harm without the intent of actually getting to that place, if you're causing harm because they made you angry or they did something embarrassing or something like that, that ceases to be discipline at that point, and it's something different.
Yeah, and then we go to the utilitarian. We go back to Kant and that whole group of them. Some people debate now whether the utilitarianism even can be viable in the 21st century, and that's an entirely different discussion. But the utilitarians said that if your primary purpose is to start out by causing harm, then you cannot say that you're doing the greatest good for the greatest number. And so if you go to movies like The Watchmen or stories of any kind, narratives of any kind, and you find someone who wants to make the world better, and by so doing that they're going to eliminate a chunk of the world, that's not ethical. And utilitarians would say, it's the idea that you're going to do something for the greatest good for the greatest number has to be diffuse. It can't be for one group over another. So if you're trying to eliminate a group, or if you're trying to subjugate a group, then you can't call yourself ethical. Even if you say, well, it's the greatest good for the greatest number, what, of imperialist people or capitalist people or whatever it happens to be, it doesn't work.
Okay. So, well, let's talk about Thanos then.
Okay. The Avengers.
Let's say that it's indiscriminate. he doesn't know which half of the universe is going to die. He just knows half of it's going to die. And he knows, or thinks that he knows, that in that getting rid of half, the rest of the universe is going to prosper. And he does have, at the very least, an eros sort of passion in him to do so. Is that a form of love? And if it's not, what is it?
It's not a form of love. It's a form of self-delusion. And I'm so glad you do this because the new movie's coming. And anyway, no, because when you listen to the dialogue, when you or read, because it's wonderful, you read the whole script online. Been released. It's not pirated, and you can see that when he says, "No one else could do this," I can't do his voice. So he says that more than once in the film, and he's willing to sacrifice anything, including his adopted daughter. Look at what I will give up in order to save the world, the universe. And nobody else can do this. This is an act of extreme arrogance. It's also an act of illogic. I mean, if you want to look at I thought about this even back when I was a younger person reading Thanos in the Avengers storylines. Okay, so you cull half the universe, half the living things indiscriminately. The indiscriminate part would be utilitarian, except that there's no knowing. I mean, if you destroy half of all the species on any planet, you're unlikely to have a healthy planet. I mean,
what if half of them is all of the males?
Well, but what if? Yes. What if half of them? I mean, just look at this for us. So that would be. So maybe we'd have 4.5 billion people left on the Earth. That's a lot of people. But if we had half, some people listening to this are going to love this, but if we had half the polar bears, what if we had half the grain diversity? What if we had half the oceanic diversity? We would die. Biodiversity, as we know, is the absolute essence of survival and thriving as an integrated ecosystem. So you could say, oh, half. Well, this makes lots of room for everybody, but it's totally without validity.
Okay. So you're making good points, but you're not off the hook yet. Here's the thing with Thanos is I think that we're coming to a point where we're trying to figure out, so is love a concept out here that we're discovering, or is it something that is within a person that they are expressing? So with Thanos, let's say he has self-delusion. Let's say he doesn't have proper mental capacities. But let's say he's still feeling that passion. In his twisted intellect, he still thinks he's doing the right thing. There's still an intellectual and an emotional engagement and with an end that he's trying to reach.
But from the outside, we just see, you just use the word, twisted. So the outside has looked in and said, this is not healthy. This is not balanced. This is not what you think that it is. But he's a fascinating character. I do not deny that to you.
Okay. Let me bring up another thing then. So I think that we're still looking at,
and I'm still on the hook.
Is love an idea? Is love an idea that we are all trying to figure out, or is it something that originates within the person and is individual to everybody? So using the line of reasoning that I think I'm misunderstanding it, but we'll see. So 50 years ago, somebody who was transgender, that sort of, or gay, hundreds of years ago or whenever, that sort of relationship might have been looked at by the majority of society and said that is twisted or something. So is love something that is being decided by societal norms and mores and that sort of thing as we progress through time? Or is it who's making this decision on what is acceptable?
Well, I'm glad you didn't let me off the hook. So no, you're not misunderstanding. You're perceiving the deep complexity of this that I can't begin to have all the answers to. But for a society to tell people what is normal, when it comes to love, and you're going to say I'm being inconsistent, but for society to say, we can define what love is. We can define what marriage is. But if they're saying that because they say, well, this has been told to us in divine intervention, it's just passing the buck to the next outsider, the bigger outsider. Well, we see it in the book, and therefore it's so. Well, books change. So, because still the idea is, I can't stand back and abide. If I am a person, and I'm not, but if I am a person who could not stand back and abide a variety of intimate love between other human beings, and if that's healthy, this is where people would get really nuts, but let them, because it is. If two people love each other and healthy as defined by aren't hurting and abusing each other and are contributing to society, and if you want to go to all the tropes, paying their taxes, working in viable jobs, volunteering in the community and so on, for a group of moralists to come along and say, no, that's not acceptable because ancient tradition tells us, to me, that's nonsense. I'm speaking on the soapbox, but unapologetically. That's not the same thing as saying, oh, well, you want to go around and you want to kill this person, this person, this person. You'll put a blindfold on, you'll just blast, and whoever you hit, well, that makes the world better. You can't equate those two things.
Right. Okay. All right. So I'm sure that will give listeners plenty to think about, everybody's coming to their own conclusions, decisions about things, but we have bigger things to talk about. We're going to run out of time. I really wanted to talk about if love can be a free will choice, if free will exists. Now, we already had that discussion, so we're going to have to operate from the assumption that we have some kind of free will.
Okay, we'll go from that assumption. Good.
So, is it a free will choice? Because if you look at it scientifically, it's pretty much 3 different cocktails of drugs that you have in your brain at different points in love based upon how new a relationship is or how committed a relationship is, this sort of thing. So how much choice is involved there as opposed to something that's just sort of bio ingrained into, okay, I'm programmed to aesthetically appreciate this and to emotionally, or, an emotional or intellectual interaction of this type is something that I find pleasing, and now I'm on this road.
Do you remember realizing that you were in love?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I remembered, I can't put a date stamp on it or a time stamp on it, but I remember being absolutely moving from fondness to fascination to wanting to be part of the interactive life of that human being who was my wife when we were very young. And so this is a digression. If it's too long, you can tell me to stop. But unfortunately, and this is a great sadness, and it has changed at the college, which is good. At the college that I went to, there was a thing which was the ugliest thing in the world. I hated the name when we got there. There's a thing that it was a book of photographs of all the incoming freshmen. And it was horrifically called the Pig Book. Mm-hmm. Now, in that book, with all those pictures, you could look and see who you were sharing, what other 600 people were there. And people, of course, would look at the book and say, oh, I'm going to be in love with this person, or I want to, have a moment with that other person, or so on. That's the ugly part. But if you scan through it and you look at it and you say, those eyes look like there's a whole lot of stuff going on behind them. I wonder what that person's like. And you have no idea that you're going to meet that person, because the chances of meeting them, even on a small campus, aren't huge. That's very different than saying, yep, there's my target. Now I'm going to go out, and you don't know if it's going to lead to love or lust or disinterest or whatever it is. But there's a moment at which, if you interact with somebody, what do you call it, whether the pheromones work or the chemicals work, or I think there's still more to it than that. I think it's the recognition of depth.
Human intuition is a fascinating thing because, every week I'm reading new studies that bring up new insights that they just didn't know about. I sent you the one about you can recognize your own face even if you don't know you saw it.
That's fascinating. Yes.
But yeah, so I agree with what you're saying. Like, I think in my case, it wasn't fondness, fascination relationship so much as fascination first. Me and my wife are very different people. And when we first met, it was, there wasn't so much fondness between us, but the fascination is there. There's something there in your intuition that says, I need to know more about what's happening here, And, I think that's an interesting part of it. So how do you think that plays in with free will? Do you think there's that fascination and then you have a choice?
I choose to go, yes. I can say this because I'm sure it'll be taken the right way, but my wife, I've told the origin story so many times with the people that were close with him. I chose to go study my Shakespeare for my first Shakespeare, actually my second class, in the lounge area, which was co-ed, in the girls' dorm where she lived. I chose to go study, read Shakespeare, take notes, and then lift my eyes from the book frequently to see if she would walk by. And when she did, then I would close my book, and people call this stalking, but it wasn't, because it took me forever to say anything. I walked, I don't know, 50 yards, 60 yards. I'd be walking along, and then when she'd go off to a class, I'd keep walking and thinking, I need to talk to this person, right? So I free will chose to go read that book in that place so that maybe I could catch a glimpse.
So looking at that
and that was adolescent, and I know, but yeah.
So there's the love at first sight sort of trope, but that sort of implies that it's a deterministic sort of thing. Don't you think like, okay, well, even if it is a fascination or sort of thing, like it's hard to suss out here, which is why I asked the question.
And that's a deep and impossible question. Was it predetermined that I was going?
And in this case, predetermined, I mean, you can look at it as some sort of religious thing, or you can look at it as a physical, evolutionary or biological thing,
Perhaps so, but if so, the process can be, in human terms, quite long.
Yeah, I think that the important part, I think that what makes it free will is that biological impetus doesn't make it destiny. You could have had those feelings, then walked up to your wife and she could have been like, no, thanks. And
I would have gone away.
That puts an end to it. Right. So I think it is free will because it takes the two. It takes the two to make it happen.
And you recognize that yes, it takes the two. And you recognize that if you are ethical or trying to be, and you are in balance, and a lot of people are, if someone says that to you, that's when the lines get crossed with people. Nope. We're intended for each other. You just don't know that yet. That kind of stuff that is really troubling. Someone says, no, thank you. You turn and you bury your head, hopefully not in a bottle of beer or maybe one, but not 10 or whatever it is. But you don't continue to say, well, I know best. That's where the arrogance, that's where the Thanosian thing comes in.
So, I mean, if you look at it, love and free will probably have the most intense relationship of any kind of free will. Love is probably the highest type of free will because you're expressing that free will every day in order to maintain your relationships. If you and I disagree on Thanos, I have the free will to say, you know what? I don't like your viewpoint. We're not doing any more podcasts. Get out of my house. All that kind of stuff. But I don't. Same thing with my wife. My wife does something obnoxious. I have the free will to say, you know what? I'm going to go. I'm done.
And if I say something stupid, then eventually, and not too long thereafter, one realizes one said something stupid, and I'm sorry, that is not what my intent was. That's the nature of relationship, right? But that is a free will kind of thing. But look at love songs. Any generation of love songs. It's all about, I was meant for you and you were meant for me. And, whatever genre of music, I defy you to go look at the lyrics and see if you're saying, well, I am choosing to be in love with you, as opposed to it's in the stars.
And I think that comes back to that. There's that ingrained human thing that we've talked about before. It's curiosity, essentially. And we have that for the beginnings of the universe. We have that for what's knowledge. I mean, that's why we're having this podcast, is that curiosity, that wanting to have answers. And so when you want to have the answers, it's sort of the easy way out to say that things were meant to be.
Deus ex machina. Here it comes. Yes.
So let's see. I don't know if we have time to talk about any of this other stuff. But I mean, I think that we had a really good conversation. And I think that some of these other things are things that will pop up in other episodes. But really, we saw how love connected to all of the other things that we've talked about. We talked about, the sense of self and how that progresses throughout time and how it relates to love. Free will, obviously a big one. Ethics, a huge, huge one, how that relates. And it was really interesting. And I'm sure that it will pop up in podcasts that we talk about in the future, how love relates to all these other things, aesthetics.
Yes, we're scaffolding. We're scaffolding as we go.
Right. So thank you for listening to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. Recording and production are provided by me, Joel Bouchard, and the song featured in the show is Questions off my album Jaguars, which you can find on Spotify or anywhere MP3s are sold. Until next time, keep popular.